All right, we're back, ladies and gentlemen, here, lesson 6b, continuing our discussion of revolutions and the Enlightenment, and we're going to move on and talk a little bit about what was going on in North and South America during this time frame. Rather than focus on Europe, we're going to look a little closer in our very own backyard and talk about colonial empires in Latin America and the American Revolution. So what's going on in terms of the American Revolution that we need to know? Well, the first is we're going to look at not only the colonies in North America, but also what was going on in Latin America. That would be Central and South America. A little bit about British North America on the eve of the American Revolution. Then we'll talk about the American Revolution itself, and finally we'll finish up with a discussion of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Probably the most important political document to come out of this time frame is the American Constitution, so we'll take a look and see why it's so important. Your reading, you're going to finish up chapter 17. It's section 4, pages 536 to 540. So we'll take a read of that once we get done with this presentation. Some new terms. Some you may know, some you may not. These are all ones you're going to need to know by the end of this chapter, though. The first is mestizo. Second is mulatto, federalism, Bill of Rights, confederation, and estates. So be looking for those as we go. The colonies in Latin America, let's start there, because we've talked a lot about Europe and we've talked a little bit about North America, but we haven't talked a great deal about Latin America for a while. So, what's going on? When last we left off, we took a look at the idea that Portugal and Spain had been kind of divided, or at least Latin America had been, and Portugal dominated Brazil, while Spain controlled the remainder of Latin America. So pretty much everything, with the exception of Brazil, was Spanish-controlled in the early colonies of Latin America, especially Central America and Northern South America. A little bit different way of governing a colony, because for the Spanish colonies especially, multiracial living arrangements were just fine. Marriages between Europeans and Native Americans were accepted. And we also, of course, because of the triangular trade, have African slaves that are present. Now, what's going on? Why are we in Latin America, and what do the European nations hope to gain? Well, the economics are based on mining and minerals. Gold and silver were mined in raw form, shipped back to Europe, and used as currency. We also had agriculture in a large scale, based on large plantations, and those plantations, just like in North America with the American slaves, required lots of African and Native American slaves to tend them. We also saw that a trade of raw materials between other European nations is important. So it's really an idea of digging stuff out of the ground or growing stuff and sending it back to Europe for trade. That's the reason the Spanish and the Portuguese are in Latin America. The French and Indian War is the name of the 7 Years' War in North America. So when we talk about the French and Indian War, it is a part of a larger war that we talked about last time. And it was really fought between the British and the French. So when we say French and Indians, the French were fighting the British, and Indian tribes were on kind of both sides. The British felt that the American colonists should pay to help their defense. It took a lot of money. The British had to send over a lot of troops, and it was very expensive, so they hoped that the Americans would pay. The American colonists got frustrated about this. They didn't want to pay. They were taxed without the opportunity to represent themselves, and this was one of the most important starting points for frustration between the American colonists and the British. Some other grievances, or things that they were frustrated about, the colonists in North America, were that there were taxes imposed upon them by Britain without any kind of voice in whether or not they wanted them. So there was no representation, and that was a famous slogan: no taxation without representation. The idea that if the British wanted to tax the Americans, they should have a right to talk about it. Some of the examples were the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, and a number of different other acts that were very small. The Tea Act is another one that required the colonists to pay money on almost everything that happened. And the colonists start to very slowly break away from Britain during this time frame. The Revolution, the American Revolution, begins really with the Spanish or the French and Indian War, but the first shots aren't fired until about 1775. And essentially what happens is the Continental Congress, which is an organization of representatives from all the different colonies in North America, appeal to the king for some changes. And the British troops are getting frustrated by the fact that the colonists are starting to hoard weapons and form militias. So they move to confiscate weapons at a little town in Massachusetts called Concord. When they come into Concord and Lexington, the British find colonists waiting to essentially to repel them. They don't want them to come in, and they don't want them to take their weapons. So 8 colonists are killed in Lexington, and 70 British soldiers are killed on the return to Boston. So we now have the fighting beginning in 1775. Now that the colonists are into it, they decide, well, if we're going to be fighting the British, we might as well go all the way and declare our independence. And so the Declaration of Independence is drawn up by the Continental Congress. The Declaration essentially has the rights that all Americans should have access to: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's written by Thomas Jefferson. It really is a list of complaints against the king. It's a listing of all the things that they're frustrated about, and essentially also that they have the right as Americans to choose their own destiny and their own government. So they send off the Declaration to the British. The British, of course, do not grant it, and the Revolutionary War begins in earnest. And it really goes from about 1775 all the way until 1781, when a combination of French and American forces defeat the British in Yorktown, which is in Virginia. And then the Treaty of Paris, which is in 1783, formally ends the war, granting America its independence, the colonies its independence from Great Britain. America is recognized internationally for its independence, and some borders are established, with Canada to the north and Spain to the south and to the west. But one of the first things that has to occur is that the United States, this new country, has to have a rule book. It has to have some sort of a guiding document. And it starts off with something called the Articles of Confederation. This is a document that kind of binds the states loosely together, but it's very, very weak. And we see very quickly that there are some things that occur where the federal government, the national government, can't respond to, and it's obviously that the Constitution is not, or excuse me, the Articles of Confederation are not going to be acceptable. So state delegates get back together, and they create a federal system within something called the U.S. Constitution that is divided into 3 branches of government: the legislative branch, which makes laws; the executive branch, which carries the laws out; and the judicial branch, which makes sure that the laws are legal. And what are they checking to make sure that the laws are legal? Well, they're checking an incredibly important document called the Bill of Rights. When the Constitution was initially ratified or initially drafted, several states were concerned that it didn't list out the rights that people had under the Constitution. And so in order for the Constitution to become the law of the land, a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, had to be added. And those first 10 amendments spell out the powers of the government and the personal freedoms that citizens within the United States have. Things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom to keep and bear arms. All these are part of the first 10 amendments, or the Bill of Rights. And it essentially becomes a model for other governments to follow in the future. So, that's a little bit about the American Revolution. You'll certainly learn a lot more about that next year in U.S. history. But for now, that's good, and go ahead and complete the rest of your assignments.